Well, I guess spring isn't done with us yet. So as an aspiring fantasy writer, I have naturally found myself on a lot of internet forums and subreddits, just sifting through and seeing what kind of questions are being brought up by people who are in a similar position as me. And one of these questions that comes up a lot has to do with, how do I balance world building and storytelling? And, it's an important issue. The whole point of fantasy is that it's a story that takes place in a world very different from our own. Whether it's the history, the geography, or, the introduction of some vibrant magic system or mythology. This question often seems to be framing storytelling and world building as opposing forces, that these are priorities that are at odds with each other. Hence, you need to balance them. For example, if you spend too much word count or time on world building, whether it's lore, exposition, or establishing rules of a magic system, that will be detrimental to the pace of the story, and therefore the reader will lose interest, which you obviously don't want. But what I'd like to do is propose an alternate solution or an alternate way of looking at it, one where world building and storytelling are not opposing or contradictory, but rather mutually beneficial, or they feed into each other. And I will be drawing inspiration for this thesis from Mistborn by Brandon Sanderson. It's a big heavy hitter amongst fantasy novels. If you've read it, you probably enjoyed it. I enjoyed it as well. And there's a lot of things that make it good, but I'm going to be focusing on its world building in particular for now. And it less has to do with the world building and more with the world presentation. You see, we as readers, we tend to be more attracted to things like character and plot. People and events just naturally resonate with us more, even if you are a hardcore fantasy or world building fan. And the reader's attention is a valuable resource that needs to be respected. Therefore, whenever you introduce an element of the world, it ideally should contribute something to the story, whether that's it serves a plot purpose, or it has some kind of impact for the characters or the mood of the story. And this coupling is what I noticed Brandon Sanderson doing in Mistborn. And this trick, like I said, has less to do with the world building and more the world presentation or the framing. What lens are we, the reader, being made to look through? So, consider Mistborn's main magic system, allomancy. At the surface level, it just seems like some kind of neat tool or weapon that some people use. And a lazy writer would leave it at just that. It basically served the same purpose as a gun. But what Brandon Sanderson does instead is he makes allomancy an actual active part of the story. For example, Vin, our main character, her whole journey is incited by allomancy when Kelsier comes looking for her on account of her allomantic abilities. And it's also what carries her story, or carries her personal evolution through the rest of the story. As she learns more about allomancy, she herself as a person is also changing. Her perceptions, her relationships, her skills, her sense of identity, her place is all evolving. It's dynamic. And because allomancy is a part of that, is coupled with it, learning about allomancy is more interesting because it's been coupled with this person, with this fleshed out character who is going through her own journey, who is going through her own changes. And allomancy, instead of just being some idle, static set piece that just kind of sits there, becomes this dynamic and interesting thing. It becomes much more emotionally investing and personal. And allomancy has the same relationship with Kelsier. Not only is he also a Mistborn with allomantic abilities, but when he experienced his snap, that was more than just him getting magical powers. It was also about him going through an extreme trauma. It was about him changing as a person, losing someone that he loved, finding new motivations and new goals. It became one of his defining moments in his life and is what made him who he is, and is one of the motivations that carries him and his actions through the rest of the story, similar to how Allomancy is coupled with Vin's journey. And it just makes Allomancy so much more interesting because, like I said, it's more than just a gun or a sword or some kind of weapon or MacGuffin. It's a personal thing. It's part of them, and it's coupled so well with their evolution and their journey that we care about it more. Now, another big aspect of fantasy world building is geography. What kind of features are there? What are the places? Where are they? And admittedly, Mistborn has fairly limited geography outside of a single city. We get a few places, but ultimately everything kind of revolves around this single geographic location. However, I think mentioning the caves and the mines of Hathsin they're still things worth bringing up because they're good examples of this. The caves obviously are relevant because it's where the rebel army hides. It's obviously an important plot point. But we also get some moments with Kelsier where he has to overcome his fears of being underground, and that ties into his role as a leader and ties into who he is as a character, his past and his traumas. And they're brief, but they're one of his more powerful moments, I think, and we really get this insight into what his true vulnerabilities are. He isn't just some tough guy on the streets. He has fears, he has insecurities, and that makes this aspect of the world building just a little bit deeper and a little bit more interesting because it's so personalizable. It's not just a static physical thing. And speaking of Kelsier's past, there's the Mines of Hathsin. Obviously, it's very significant from a characterization perspective because it's part of his past, gave him motivation, etc. But it also serves a critical plot purpose. It's not just something that sits there. It reinforces the status quo or the situation that our characters find themselves in because through its adium production. And of course, the status quo is what our characters are trying to change. That's the whole point of a plot, is to change the status quo, change the situation, so that we leave off somewhere where we were not before. And it has this caveat that anything that happens at this physical location, anything that happens with this piece of the world, is going to be very significant. The Mines of Hathsin are an active, operational, dynamic piece of the world. They're not just some rock that sits and does nothing. If something were to disrupt the normal operations of this part of the world, that would be very significant. The situation, the status quo would be turned up on its head, and we see that happening when Kelsier goes and destroys the adium geodes. If he had gone somewhere else and tried to do that, the effect wouldn't have been the same. So there's a lot more personal and physical stakes lying on the condition of this piece of the world. If the condition of this piece of the world were to change, then the ramifications would be huge. Not just the situation of the world, but also the situation of the characters. They have these goals and these plans, and with these minds having their condition be changed, the plans and the goals are going to change for the characters. And in this way, the mines serve more than just being a physical location, but also they take on a bit more of a MacGuffin type role. They are kind of like a device that pushes the plot along. It sets the conditions that our characters are forced to deal with, and that just makes it more interesting on top of the personal significance it has to some of the characters. Now, I can probably guess what you're thinking. That the great houses and the nobilities described in this story are boring, and despite having plot relevance, are not that interesting. And I would say, yeah, I personally found that middle section of the story that focused a lot on dances and houses and nobility to be the slowest part of the book. However, I, as well as many of you, still willingly went through that part despite how slow it was. So why? If it's so slow, why were we still invested? Why did we still go through with it? For one, when we are exploring the dances and learning about the nobility and getting this deluge of politics, we are looking at it through Vin's point of view. We are in her mindset, so we're not just receiving information, we are also watching her process it. We're watching her figure out what the significance of this information is. We are watching her attitudes change. We get these descriptions of these halls that alter her perceptions of the nobility. So we're kind of getting this internal movie of what her psychology is. And that in and of itself, although it's still serving a bit of an expositional purpose by gathering information, it's still a bit more interesting. We still get a sense that, this is dynamic. Things are going on. We're making progress. It's a slow grind, but it's still a grind. We're still moving forward. And although it's the slowest part of the book, it never actually stalls and falls apart. The second thing about the nobility and the great houses and how it is presented to us is that it's actually kept fairly simple. You've got all these dozens of houses, all these hundreds of members of the nobility, yet we only get to understand maybe 3 houses, maybe 5 individuals from the nobility, and we are only shown what we absolutely need to be shown. It's if you consider the scope of the nobility, we're actually given a fairly narrow slice of it. It's the only part we actually explore. And the third part is the payoff. And it kind of ties into the first point I made, is that while we are gathering this information, we know that there's going to be a payoff. We know what the purpose is. Even though it's slow, we know what the end goal is. We're getting to it very slowly, but we are always carrying that sort of visualization, that concept of what is that thing we are moving towards. We know that the goal is to destabilize the nobility and to turn them against each other, basically create a civil war that disrupts the power structure. We know that every inquiry that Vin makes amongst the nobility, we know that every conversation she has is meant to serve a purpose. So even if the progress is slow, the progress is still there. And then once we finally do get to the part where the nobility starts to turn on itself, that's the payoff. It's very satisfying. It makes the slow burn worth our while, even if it wasn't entirely fun to go through it. And if you're still not convinced, imagine this scenario. What if Brandon Sanderson had spent 200 pages going over the state of the nobility and of the great houses and of their internal politics, but it didn't actually lead to anything? What if we spent a whole bunch of time learning about these affairs and who hates who and who are rivals and who's allies, but having it not actually contribute anything, to not actually have an impact on the situation or be significant to what our main characters are trying to accomplish? That would have been a much greater letdown. And not only would it have been slow, but there wouldn't have been any payoff at the end. So it's better to be, slightly bored for a while and have a great payoff at the end than it is to be bored for a short while and not get a payoff at the end. In other words, if you think the nobility section and politics sections of this book were slow, then I say you should be grateful because it could have been a lot worse. Now, just to clarify, not every world element that is introduced necessarily has to be purely plot-serving in its purpose. It doesn't necessarily have to be a plot-driving force. It can be something that establishes a theme or a mood, something like the mist in Mistborn. The mist really doesn't serve a plot purpose. You could tell a very similar story without the mist existing. You could just replace it with another mechanism. But what it does do very well is it sets the tone, it sets the mood. It's also a reflection of Vin's character. By the end of the story, by the end of the book, she's got this very shifting and formless sense of self. She has this very unrooted sense of what her place is in the world, of where she belongs, and that is a point of anxiety for her, and it's a part of her character, and it makes her more compelling. So in this way, you have this world building element and this character building element that are feeding off of each other, and it just adds depth to the story. Similarly, the way Sazed is speaking frequently to Kelsier about religion isn't just some extraneous thing. I mean, from a plot perspective, it is pretty extraneous because it doesn't contribute any plot element, but it does establish some dynamics of Kelsier as a character. It establishes that he is searching for meaning. He is searching for purpose and motivation in a world that is fairly soulless and that doesn't seem to have hope. So again, you have this aspect of the world and this aspect of character working off of each other.